All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this special series on materials matter. We are going to preview an AIAU session that was given to us by AIA National to preview. We're just going to be showing 25 minutes of content of the AIU video, and we'll be skipping through a few of the parts to allow time towards the end for a panel discussion. We're joined by three awesome gals, Tori, Wickard, Annie, Bevan, and Jen Wong, and I'll let them introduce themselves after the video. First of all, just want to thank our sponsors, as usual, Indoor Weather Professionals, Pilgrim, and Hill and Wilkinson. Can't do this without you all. So today, like I said, we're going to be going over Materials Matter part of this series. We're going to have three more sessions of this series: at AIA 2030 Challenge, one on April 29th, a health and wellness focused one on May 13th, and a resilience and adaptation one on June 17th. So just keep an eye out for more information on those. You can RSVP on the AIA Austin website. All right, well, I will pull up the video here just to run through the learning objectives. We're going to understand potential impacts of materials on human health and the environment, identify tools available to architects to translate health and environmental information for practical implementation, understand policy and market drivers influencing material improvements, and identify actions you can undertake today to improve material performance. So when the audio starts, it might be a little faint, so I suggest you all turn up your volume. And when we start, when we go off of the screening, I suggest you turn it down, otherwise we'll be yelling at you. So just FYI.
I think our clients would be surprised to know how little we know about the environmental and health consequences of the materials that we put into their buildings. Once they're aware that we have this gap, then we need to make them aware of that to be totally honest about what we know and what we don't know. But we can start to talk about analogies, because this notion of knowing what's in it, what its consequences are, is prevalent throughout all aspects of our economy except building materials, I would argue. You would not buy a household appliance without knowing what its Energy Star score would be. You would not buy an automobile without knowing what its miles per gallon are. And you would not buy food without having looked at the food labeling, at the nutrition labeling. Nutrition labeling is a useful analog for where we're going now with the ingredients inventory reporting that we're asking for. A colleague of mine at Smith Group, Greg Mella, has often talked about the grocery store as an analog. And he says, you go into the grocery store and you turn right, and you go through the vegetables and the fruits, and you turn left, and you go along the outside wall past all of the dairy, and you turn left again, and you go past the meat and the fish. You turn left again, and you go past the bakery, and then the pharmacy, and you check out. And all of that stuff in the middle, the stuff with all of the ingredients that you don't know what they are, you don't even mess with that, and you're eating a lot more healthy. Well, in building materials, we can't do that. We've got to go into those middle aisles with all of the different ingredients to begin to actually populate our buildings with all of the high performance insulations and coatings and floor coverings and the high durability materials, etc. We have to go for those things in the middle aisle with all of the ingredients.
There are several different areas where materials really have a huge negative impact on the environment and human health, and therefore an opportunity to really make a big difference. I would start with carbon. Climate change is a huge issue in our time, and carbon is a really interesting one from a building's perspective, because we often think about carbon from building operations. The fact that we're burning fuels to heat and cool and light a building over time is the big issue. But in fact, there is a time factor with carbon. The longer the carbon is residing in the atmosphere, the more it's contributing to climate change. And so when you look at a building, there's a huge amount of carbon that goes into making all the products that go into that building, and that all happens right up front, right at the moment you're constructing that building. The second is in terms of biodiversity and habitat impacts, right? Raw materials come to a project from all over the world. We're in a global economy, and often we're really removed from the impacts that happen where that extraction, it might be tropical forests in Indonesia or Brazil, or it might be aluminum mining and smelting in Scandinavia, or these things are happening far away from us. It's easy for us to not see those and therefore not realize they exist and the impact they have. But often what happens in the process of making those materials is really disruptive to ecosystems, to the biodiversity that the life on this planet depends on. And so the choices that we make in that regard are really important as well. And then in terms of hazardous ingredients and both human and ecosystem health, just the fact that many of these products also have pretty toxic stuff in them. And that toxic stuff can be a factor, yes, for people in the building. And there you want to look at what's the risk of exposure. Are people actually likely to be exposed to that? But even if that risk of exposure to the occupants of the building is minimal because that stuff is locked up, or that that exposure is contained, the fact that that toxic stuff got into that product means that somewhere up the chain it probably was exposing people or ecosystems. So it's not enough to say, well, we've controlled the exposure for the end user, so therefore it doesn't matter that there's hazardous materials in the product. When we talk about health issues, there's the common language, the language that is used a lot in the medical industry is acute and chronic. Acute is something sudden and damaging. You might be break an arm, right? That's an acute health issue. Whereas chronic is a long-term thing. Smoking over time, doesn't do any immediately evident damage, but over a long period of time, it increases your risk of cancer and emphysema and all those things. That's more of a chronic issue. Often we tend to think of ecological impacts like climate change and human health as being separate things, but actually, like everything in this world and the environment, they're inextricably integrated, combined. So for example, the fact that climate is changing, that weather patterns are changing, warm areas are moving north, and things like disease vectors, mosquitoes that carry tropical diseases are coming north with them. Historically, over geologic time, these kind of changes happened over thousands of years, and species evolved and adapted to survive in those changing conditions. Now they're happening over decades. There's just not time to adapt to those changes, and that's part of the reason we're seeing species extinction at an unprecedented rate as well. So not to get too doom and gloom about this, but this is really something that we need to address head on, and we can, as designers. There are choices we can make that are lower carbon and therefore going to help solve these problems. And in fact, in some cases, there's choices you can make that will take carbon out of the atmosphere, that will actually not just minimize the harm, but be a net benefit because, for example, building out of wood is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it up in the building. So I would say the big three really are looking at carbon climate impacts, looking at biodiversity and habitat impacts, and looking at hazards and hazards in the product. And also exposure, but including exposure throughout that entire supply chain, really are where you want to look for those opportunities.
Regardless of the size of your practice, or whether you're a commercial developer or a single-family home owner who's building and designing their new home, material transparency is fundamentally important to everyone. I think especially the general public, given the amount of regulation and safety that we have, particularly in North America with our building codes, would be shocked to know that there is a lack of knowledge of the ingredients that make up our building products. So chemical regulation in this country is rife with holes, and part of the issue is a lack of information and research on those chemicals. So with that climate in mind, we as architects have a very impactful role in which we can take action now. We don't need to wait over 60 years for a chemical to be removed from its everyday use. We can start identifying what these issues are, and we can be selecting better building products. So we knew asbestos was a concern early on, and it took decades to get it out of our buildings. Similarly, we have chemicals of concern, and we need to be ridding our products of those toxins. In particular, bioaccumulated toxins are showing up in our bloodstreams, and we are exposing our occupants. We build buildings, we design buildings for people, and people need healthy places in which to live. We sometimes, as architects, are the only designers on a team, and our first moves, those first decisions, can follow through to the very end and every detail of a project. And we need to be mindful of how those very conceptual decisions that we're making about design can impact everything from the structure to the interior product design and detailing.
Life cycle thinking is a real paradigm shift in where we've been in sustainability, thinking about products, where we've really tended to focus on single attributes like recycled content or distance that a product is shipped. And those attributes are really just a slice of the full environmental profile of a product. Where we're going now is to recognize that a product or a process has an environmental impact that is over the full life of the product, from resource extraction through to end of life and disposal. That's what we call cradle to grave. That's life cycle thinking. And life cycle assessment, LCA, is an analytical technique for estimating the lifetime environmental impacts of a product. It looks at all of those stages from cradle to grave, looks at the inputs and outputs between the product and nature, and then estimates the ultimate impact on the environment in terms of things like global warming or smog creation.
It's important to recognize that even though it sounds like a life cycle assessment is going to be comprehensive and cover all the impacts, in reality, it focuses on those things that are easy to quantify because it's all about numbers. It's all about measuring impacts. There are a lot of things like impacts on habitat and biodiversity that are not as easy to put numbers on. LCA really doesn't include those. And also some of the human health things that we're concerned about, especially exposure to really hazardous compounds, are also not typically incorporated in an LCA.
Buildings obviously impact the environment, and the way that we usually think about that is in the consumption of operating energy. To operate the building over the course of its life, we're very focused and have been for a long time on how do we reduce that consumption of fossil fuel. Where we're beginning to shift our attention is to what we might call the upstream impacts of the building. So what was the environmental impact to make that building to begin with? And we're starting to understand that there's a tremendous environmental impact due to that building before we turned on the lights for the very first time. And that is primarily the environmental impact of the materials that it took to make the building, in addition to the process of construction. On top of that, we have impacts that are very much downstream, so the end of life, what happens when the building is all finished and we need to do something with those materials, and what are the environmental impacts of demolition, transportation to landfill, and then what happens at that point. So the real interest now is in the upstream. What are the environmental impacts of making the building? It's primarily a materials impact, so it's all of the energy and water and material resources required to make those products. It's the emissions to air, land, and water in extracting the raw resource to make the products and getting them to the site and so forth. So that's the embodied impacts of materials, and that's really a very substantial portion of a building's footprint, and becomes really, really important as we move towards net zero buildings.
So we can identify the life cycle stages of buildings in 5 phases: extraction of materials, the manufacture of products, the construction of a building, the use of the building, and the demolition, renovation, and end of life. There are clearly different impacts at each stage. I think the big important factors are where they are and where they are in terms of their impacts over time. Extraction of a raw material probably does not occur near the building site, or typically not. So those are far removed impact. They can be far removed sort of personally or within the community that a building is being built. So somebody somewhere is going to experience that. Those are external. They can be often very crude, because extraction's crude. Actually, the single largest causes of occupational death in this country are in the mining industries and the forestry industries. After that, it's actually construction. So we know there's a lot of dangerous stuff happening to get materials out of the earth or from the forest. You think about production or manufacturing of a product. Now you're actually combining a lot of materials. You might have also significant emission or other types of waste effects that are happening. Construction, we can think about that again a couple of different ways. The local impact of reducing stormwater erosion from a site is a pretty simple effect. The waste that's created, and of course that's going to go somewhere, and the landfill typically is in that region, so the burden of that is within the community. The use phase is the occupant, all of us living in our buildings or working in our buildings. So what are the indoor environmental quality effects that we may experience? Research has shown that the average American spends about 87% of their life inside a building. We actually spend another 6% in our cars, I was interested to learn. So 93% of our life is in some enclosed space, and we are affected, of course, by that condition, the material emissions and the psychological as well. And end of life, we often don't think about end of life because landfills can be out of sight. We demolish buildings very quickly. You might go by one day and the next day it's gone, so it's not a huge presence in our thoughts.
One of the considerations that is really useful to think about as you look at materials and products and those choices is wanting to align the service life of those products with how long you expect to need them. So you don't want to invest too much. You don't want to create titanium, door locks if they're just going to be used for a few years and then thrown away, right? But you want to think about what's the expected lifespan of the building? What's the expected, and even not just the building as a whole, but even different systems in the building. Commercial interiors, tenant fit outs tend to be churned every 7 to 10 years just because of the economic cycle. So it doesn't make sense sometimes to invest in tremendous durability in those interior finishes if they're just going to be swapped out based on style and fashion or new tenants moving in anyway. at the other end of things, you want to make sure that the things that are likely to be there a long time really are durable and can hold up, because if you're looking at environmental impacts and you have to make something and then at some point make it all over, replace it and make it all over again just because it didn't hold up, well, you've lost the benefit of any reduced environmental impact and having to remanufacture it. So this whole concept of thinking about the service life of products, how long they're likely to be needed, and aligning that with the anticipated durability is an important piece of thinking about looking at it, what makes the most sense in terms of the best product for a particular function.
For years, we have been into new materials because they will be the recycled materials of the future.
In talking about materials and trying to understand their impacts, there's a role for both disclosure, which is just about exposing information, and assessment, which is about interpreting that information and trying to use it to make better choices. So in the case of disclosure, you might have something like an environmental product declaration or an EPD, which is actually a specific format for reporting the results of a life cycle assessment. It's going to report the quantities of different flows, different things like carbon emissions and the resources used to make a product and other pollutants. But more importantly, it's going to also report the quantification of what are the environmental impacts of those flows. So it's not the carbon emissions exactly that it's reporting, but it's the climate change impact, or it's the human health impact in terms of smog emissions and how that might affect the lifespan of people who are subjected to that. So all of that is in the realm of disclosure because it's just disclosing information.
An environmental product declaration, EPD, doesn't necessarily indicate whether a product is good or bad. In fact, the whole point is it's non-judgmental. It's just transparently communicating data. So just because there's an EPD doesn't necessarily mean that this is a product that we might call green. But the fact that the manufacturer did the EPD tells me that they are on the right path, and I want to acknowledge that, celebrate that step by industry to doing what they need to do to help evolve sustainability in the construction sector.
In my contact with manufacturers as an architect specifying materials, I routinely ask for disclosure documentation, and I allow people to find their way to that path through any number of different routes. It doesn't matter a whole lot to me as long as they're starting down that path. I find when there are manufacturers who say that we don't yet have that, that it is valuable for me to be able to say, oh, but your competitor so-and-so has provided that already. Nobody out there has a monopoly. They're all scrambling for my business, for our business as architects and designers. And so knowing that their product is being viewed negatively relative to a competitor's product on the basis of this particular attribute is of value. I also make sure that manufacturers understand that our choices, as they always have been, are a function of lots of different issues: cost, availability, preference, color, where it's manufactured, and so forth. This is yet another piece that we need to add into that whole puzzle so that we can make a conscious, deliberative, willful choice about materials.
At the same time, you have a lot of programs out there that are environmental certifications, and what they do is they have a particular standard that they say if products that meet XYZ requirements in terms of whatever it is they're measuring, the carbon footprint and the water use and the ecosystem impacts and the health impacts, products that meet a certain set of requirements can receive this seal of approval. So a program like Cradle to Cradle, for example, has 5 categories that they look at. There's material health and material utilization and energy. and water and social impacts, all of those categories are assessed. And if the product meets the requirements, meets the standards that they've set out in all those categories, it can get certified as a cradle-to-cradle product. And then there's different levels of certification. There's basic and silver, or bronze and silver and gold. And so in that case, you might actually have less disclosure. You might be getting less detail, less actual information, but you're getting that specific seal of approval. So it's simpler to deal with, but it's less powerful if you want to then do more with that information. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. There's different approaches might suit different needs in the industry.
I think there's something powerful with transparency labels. We can see that in our vehicles, for example. We use miles per gallon. We use that analogy, and we're seeing it with energy performance in buildings. We're highlighting. When you make the invisible visible, people have a chance to act on that. It's bringing the importance to the forefront. If we don't know what ingredients are in our building products, then people don't think it's important. If it's important, we need to know what it is, and then we need the tools to be able to act on it and to make the impact through labeling of throughout their business.
When we think about what role various parties have in the material ecosystem, the architects and designers play a very central role because we are the ones that specify materials most of the time, accepting issues of color and pattern and taste kinds of things where you would bring a selection to an owner. Most of the time the owner is content for us to make the decisions about what materials go into buildings. That means that the manufacturers have to spend time courting the architects and designers in order to get their materials specified. That puts us singularly in a position of asking for new information from the manufacturers. So whereas the owners are the ones who are going to benefit from greater attention to health issues, and contractors are the ones who are going to have contractual relationships with the manufacturers or with the suppliers directly, we as architects don't occupy either of those positions, but we are the ones who are making the decision. So if we ask for information of the manufacturers, they're obligated to listen to us or to suffer the consequences in the marketplace of being identified as someone who is not attending to the desires of the customer. I would hope through education people could see both that it's part of the moral imperative of what we signed on for as architects. I mean, as architects, we are licensed by the state to protect health and well-being. So it is part of our moral obligation, but also that there are emerging tools that will enable us to participate in this, whether it's simply at the level of encouraging disclosure so that the market can work, or going further than that to start to say, these materials are better than those materials because of the absence of red listed or banned chemicals. At whatever place you want to enter the conversation, we have the tools available to make it possible. We are getting to that place. We're not there yet, but you know, when we first started looking at recycled content, there was no information available. And that quickly changed, and now you can get that information about any building material. Our work with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for the Brock Environmental Center, which has been certified by the Living Building Challenge, we spent thousands of hours vetting all of the materials in order to make sure that we were in compliance with the avoidance of red list chemicals. It was a major task. Now, the availability of industry-wide lists of materials that met the red list, that did not exist when we started. Now, and we actually published our material vetting protocol and the lists. We published it online so that the next people to come along would be able to do that. And now the Living Building Challenge has that as a requirement, I believe, of the completion of the program, that you let people know what the materials you found were that would meet the red list prohibition. The red list is a very useful kind of first cut, but it isn't all that we should be looking at. Over time, we'll be able to characterize more and more of these chemicals in more and more sophisticated ways. The red lists are likely to expand, but our ability to evaluate materials on the basis of a broader suite of concerns, I think, will be enhanced over time. One of the things about a red list that is particularly valuable has to do with the limits of our abilities as architects. We are not industrial hygienists. We are not toxicologists. We are not in a position to represent that we can look at a list of ingredients and make judgments as to whether something is safe or not. We do not make any judgments about the risk associated with these hazards, about the exposure, etc. A red list allows us to participate in screening materials by their ingredients without needing to have the subtlety of that scientific background. We can simply say it's a binary decision. Yes, it has phthalates. No, it doesn't have phthalates. Yes, it has PVC. No, it doesn't have PVC. We can look down that list and make that really quick judgment and represent to our clients that that's exactly what we're doing. We're not saying something is safer or less safe, because we don't have the capability to do that.
Expanding how we look at materials and what are the criteria in which we're selecting them, it can be quite overwhelming when you're in practice. There's a lot of different things that you can do to make this manageable. Internally, you can start identifying products in your library. Do they have an environmental product declaration? Do they have a declare label, cradle to cradle material health certificate, or a health product declaration? There are a lot of different systems out there to help designers make material selection easier. So once you've identified these items in your library, then you can start changing your specifications that you might use typically within your office. I think it's really important too to have the conversation about material selection and optimization outside of the office. First, with the entire supply chain, we need to be talking to manufacturer reps. We need to be talking to everyone who's involved in the built environment and material production and selection. And then we need to have these material conversations with our clients. What is the role of materials on a particular project? Project types are going to differ. How are products going to be selected? Perhaps there's more of an environmental focus on some projects. Perhaps it's a particular population within a building, and we need to be looking more at health aspects, and then they might really be balanced between the two. It really depends project by project, and you can start creating.
All right. If you want to turn your volume down so I'm not yelling in your ear, we're going to start our panel discussion. I'm sorry that we can't share the whole video with you all, but this is a preview, and we will put a link to the whole AIAU course if you are interested in the rest of the sessions. So just present here. So we are joined today by with Tori Wickard with Perkins&Will. She's one of my colleagues. She works in the Dallas office, and she's been a big part of building the Perkins&Will's material library and educating folks about materials health. We have Bevan from Mindful Materials, and Jen Wong from UTSOA Materials Lab. And I'll just let you all quickly introduce yourselves. Tori, if you want to go first.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me to be a part of this conversation. I think it's a really important one. And as you mentioned, I'm a project architect in the Dallas studio of Perkins&Will, and I also co-direct the Material Performance Lab for the Dallas studio. So I've been fortunate enough to learn a lot about this subject matter through working on a project for the American Cancer Society. Go ahead, Annie.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me as well. I'm Annie Bevin. I am the Executive Director of Mindful Materials. I also wear a couple other hats in the industry and come from a manufacturing background. Can say thanks for sharing that video. It's the first time I've seen that. Know all speakers very well, but what an inspiring way to kick off this conversation. So thanks again for having me.
And hi all, I'm Jen Wong. As Kendall mentioned, I'm the director of the Materials Lab, which is part of the School of Architecture. We have an academic library, just a massive collection of, I think, over 28,000 individual building samples. And we're a really great resource for our students, but we also love to serve our alumni population, which is really large in Austin, and welcome local professionals as well outside of our alumni group. So it's really fantastic to be here, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So we just want to stop sharing, ask a few questions, and Ashley has been monitoring questions in the Q&A or the chat box. So we'll put through some of those questions in addition in a moment. But I just want to start by asking all of you, what are like the major changes that you're seeing in the industry when it comes to material choices?
So for me personally, I've focused a lot of my energy around material health and understanding the substances of concern that are going into building products. But what I've seen a lot more of recently, I would say within the past year and a half or so, is an importance placed on the embodied carbon content going into building materials, and really a shift in the focus from less about material health and more about the embodied carbon.
Just to piggyback off of that, Mindful Materials is a library resource that's created by industry for industry. It's a free resources for users to go and find sustainability data for numerous different manufacturers, different types of products within projects. But I totally agree with Tori that we were sort of focused on human health there for a while, and now the industry is sort of now refocusing on carbon. But I am really of the opinion that we can't not continue to focus on all. And what I really enjoyed about the video that we just saw is that it really broke down really 5 buckets of what really is a material health, and it comes to climate health, human health, ecosystem health, social health and equity, and the circular economy. And I feel like that might feel a little overwhelming to be like, oh my gosh, how do all these products meet all of that different criteria? But that is actually a lot of the work that Mindful Materials is working on, is aligning that framework, that definition of what is a good material to use, and then finding those products that align with those buckets so people can make easier decisions and choices. So yes, I totally agree with Tori that embodied carbon is sort of the biggest topic, because buildings equate to 40% of all carbon impacts, and 11% of that is the building products that go into buildings themselves. So we have some work to do in the supply chain, but we can't forget about all of the other aspects at the same time we're battling carbon.
Yeah, and I'll just add that while I don't claim knowledge of the industry necessarily, I'm very much part of academia. I have noticed in my last 8 years at the Materials Lab just a really growing intensification of interest from our students, and really just an urgency coming from them for more information, to address these kind of gaps in their education that still aren't being completely met. I have noticed, obviously increased interest in embodied carbon, also biodiversity, the effects of extraction, and also what happens downstream. So I know that we're talking a lot about upstream things here, but I'd love to get to downstream as well.
Absolutely.
That's great. What can designers do, in your opinion, to encourage more material manufacturers to produce and publish forms of transparency?
I can jump in just as a manufacturer background and a manufacturer myself. I work for a communication cable manufacturer also as their global head of sustainability. And I can say when I'm having conversations with folks like Tori and others, it's the fact that the question has been asked. Do you have HPDs? Do you have declare labels? Do you have environmental product declarations? Have you done an LCA on your product? These questions go a very long way. So I can say, hey, President of Superior Essex, I actually got asked by an architect if we had this stuff, and we actually calculate how many times we're asked. So just starting by asking the question, do you have these things, will really go a long way in enabling the change, because the more that's asked, the louder the voice, the more commitment will be made to reduce the impact, just like Russ Perry was saying in that video.
It seems like such a simple thing to say, like, this is such a complicated problem. Just ask the question about what's in the materials. But I actually had an experience a couple years ago where I asked a product rep what was in his product, and he had no clue. So he said, I'll get back to you. And when he came back to me, you could see like the despair from him, because his family had been struggling with some health issues from living downstream of a PFAS manufacturing plant. And he knew about the issues as they related to his family and their medical problems, but he had no clue that that was actually product going into the product that he repped. So I think it's really important to ask the question, as Annie said, but also something I have found that goes a long way is to make the issue relatable to what's going on in people's personal lives. And I feel like that makes it resonate more. And I believe with that particular rep, it opened his eyes to the need to know what's in his products and others.
People certainly don't know what they don't know. So it's all about communication, education, and awareness. And kind of goes back to the conversation, right, Tori? It's like, hey, we just have to start talking about these things, and we can't just sweep it under the rug that materials are not, there is an impact in a building, and the impact starts with the raw material supply into making the building itself. So gotta just increase the conversation as much as possible.
Yeah, a lot of times I find when I'm talking to designers about this subject, there's often kind of this initial sense that, hey, we have so much on our plate already. You know, we have to first just make sure we're picking a product that's going to be durable, or that meets the project budget, or that, you know, has the aesthetics that we want in the project. And you're asking me to do this one additional thing. But as architects and designers, it's really our ethical and moral obligation to be considering these things. There was actually a resolution passed by the AIA that took it a step further than just beyond health, safety, and welfare. It actually specifically stated that designers needed to consider the environmental and human health impacts of materials. But again, if you really want it to hit home with designers, you have to start talking to them about what's going on in their lives. You know, how would this potentially impact them if they were working or living in this building that you're designing?
One challenge that we've encountered at the Materials Lab is that, you know, since we are kind of research focused, we're always looking towards the future. So we're looking at these materials that are kind of on the cutting edge, and it's been kind of tough seeing some of these smaller manufacturers who are trying new and different things fold, you know, over time, because they don't have the support. They don't have necessarily the resources to put into these types of reports. What is the middle ground for you guys there in terms of finding ways to support these manufacturers?
Yeah, it's sort of the embattlement a little bit, but I think if people start to, one, have communications with their suppliers, is something you can do as a part of R&D. Just say, hey, I need to know what's in this material that you're providing us. That's just part of the work that you can take on as a manufacturer, just asking that question. And that will actually give you a lot of answers to be able to be either transparent or start to know, oh gosh, I have this really bad stuff in my product. I need to optimize this a little bit more by screening it to lists that are free. You can screen for free your chemistry. When it comes to life cycle impacts, though, that's where the costs start to come in. And it's a little bit more difficult without buying software, but you can actually start to just benchmark your operations. So energy, water, waste. Are you able to reduce those impacts in any way? Are you able to find suppliers that are a little closer? These are all things that would be taken into conceptualization of, hey, this is actually going to reduce my environmental impact because I'm sourcing from a more local source, or that supplier has told me they've reduced their energy usage by X and as opposed to another supplier. So taking the concepts of life cycle assessment and applying them to practice is a way that I think smaller manufacturers who can't afford a larger price tag of an official LCA into an EPD could start to make some inroads to optimization. I can say there are tools being created out there, which I'm really excited about to hear, to make life cycle assessment more easy and accessible to everyone, because that's ultimately how we can address embodied carbon. And we can't even imagine that everybody could pay the money to get an EPD at scale. So I'm really excited for those tools to, revolutionize the world.
I see a question in the chat from Mita asking if there's a list of questions somewhere and how and which questions to ask. And I would encourage each of you to check out the website for the Texas Materials Initiative. I'm a member of the group, and there are chapters in Dallas, Austin, and Houston. And the group has put together just a one-pager list of questions that you can ask your reps. And I would encourage you not to think of this as an overwhelming task, but really just realize that if you ask one question, it's better than asking no questions. And the way I like to approach this with our designers in-house is to ask them to consider what are the highest volume finishes that they have on their project. So whether they're literally identifying one highest volume product, that's better than identifying 0. And ultimately, we like them to identify up to 10 on a project and start there. So start with the number one finish that you have on a project and approach that manufacturer and ask what's in your product, what type of transparency documents exist for this product. And then from there, you can really start kind of scrutinizing those documents and seeing what type of information they disclose.
Thanks, Tori, for mentioning that. I think that it'd be really valuable for some folks on the call, especially those that might be at a smaller firm, to understand how the libraries that you all are associated with started and how they've evolved since their inception.
Well, Annie has the largest library probably of the group, so I'll let her go first. Well, I don't know, Jen, how many products did you say you have in yours?
Library too.
I think we mentioned something like 28 to 29,000 individual samples, but Annie, go ahead and take the question.
Sure. So Mindful Materials was created back in 2014. HKS, a large architect and design firm, was getting a lot of questions because around the same time LEAP version 4 was first coming out, though it was coming out for years, right? It still is. So they were getting asked by a lot of owners, hey, we want to meet the materials requirements. Please make sure you're finding products with EPDs and HPDs. And they were needing to go to every single manufacturer's website. Every manufacturer's website's different. They have their data in different places. It's not always apparent where that information is. Is that actually a LEED compliant document? It was very much not clear. And so ultimately what they realize is that, hey, we need to create a library where we can just start to collect and aggregate all the sustainability data that meets this certain criteria that we're looking for in one place. And ultimately, Mindful Materials is just that. And it was born out of HKS, but HKS looked around and said, hey, everybody needs this. We can't keep this. So they gifted it to the market. And Mindful Materials became an official business in 2019. And it's by industry, for industry. So it's industry owned and led. Nobody fiscally owns Mindful Materials. It is honestly a database that's out there to enable architects, designers, contractors, owners to find products that have sustainability data, but also meet a certain baseline of criteria. So we have a really powerful group of volunteers, all experts in materials. Tori is one of them, who come in and provide feedback on what really does, what is a sustainable product. And we actually have every product that goes into the library reviewed to this certain set of criteria, in which case then it becomes a mindful material. And so it's available in the database to find. So it's a curated set of data that meets a certain set of criteria requirements that would meet the sustainability goals of almost every project out there. And it's put together in a certain lens, so you could actually search for products that have an EPD, or products that have an HPD, or products that contribute to LEED, or projects that contribute to WELL. So that's ultimately where it came from and what it is now. And we're also, in addition to a data hub, a collaboration hub. So we recognize there's not really a place nationally or globally to rally behind healthy materials. So we're collaborating with AIA and everybody else in the ecosystem to really raise awareness to the materials that go into buildings and how we can all take action together. So if you're looking for a place to sort of join, learn more, become a part of the community, Mindful Materials is a place to go.
And at Perkins&Will, we actually kind of started with Mindful Materials with our own library, in-house library, where we store all of our finished samples. And we also have our own precautionary list, which is a list of substances that we want our designers to avoid. So we kind of wanted to take a cross-reference of the precautionary list substances and the data that we got from Mindful Materials. And for those that have been around for a while doing this, you'll know Mindful Materials really kind of started with stickers that you would put on the outside of the binder. And so what we were finding is that designers would see a sticker that said Mindful Materials and think, okay, this is a good product, I'll grab that binder. And we wanted to just take it a step further and cross-reference essentially which of those products were free of the substances that were on our precautionary list. So we created kind of our own database of materials that we classified or assessed as being optimized as being precautionary list free. And so for us, it was just meant to be a very quick visual representation of which products were healthier, so that when designers would go into the library, they might choose the binder that had the green sticker on it over the binder that had the yellow sticker, because they wanted to make a healthier selection for products that were maybe apples to apples otherwise. So that's how our library really started, and it's evolved greatly. And now we're kind of in conversations about how do we also indicate embodied carbon content within our library. So it's been a labor of love, but such a great tool for designers to have at their fingertips.
And I'll say that in many ways, I'm envious of these later collections that are able to have a more kind of focused curatorial approach. Our collection started in 2001, and we have really, a different mission where we're educating students at the beginning of their careers. And so they're just learning about materials in general. They're getting that first introduction to the things that our built environment is really constructed out of. So we have a really comprehensive collection. We try to have as many materials as we can to show them both the basics, but also then, those things that we're interested in here, the topics that we're talking about today. And what we've done in sort of compensation for that is started to pull out curated collections, smaller collections of like 50 materials at a time, based around different themes, and we'll do exhibitions and share those lists with our students. We also focus on one material per week that we're really excited about, which we highlight through our Instagram every Monday or Tuesday. So that's another way that we can kind of just focus attention from just the thousands of materials that we otherwise have.
So
It's kind
important
of
to educate the
interesting.
youth. Yeah, that's really, really impactful. That's
Well, it's
really exciting to
interesting
hear.
that you talk about, students' first exposure to building materials is in school. Obviously, I've been practicing for almost 16 years, and I think it's taken me about 15 years to figure out that all of the really cool materials that I tended to gravitate towards are the ones that are synthetic, artificial, loaded full of chemicals. And now that I've been kind of thinking along this train of thought, the synthetic kind of cool space age materials really are the ones that aren't great for us. So I think it's interesting that it's taken me 15 years to really make that conclusion.
It's a big world. There's a lot to sift through. And like I said, it wasn't a part of education when I went through, undergrad and graduate school in architecture 10 years ago, and it still isn't a huge part. So hopefully we'll get there.
You've been doing an awesome job, Jen. Well, we have one question from the audience, and then we'll have to wrap things up. But I think you all can answer it. Where would people find information on the various residential insulation options in regards to EPDs, carbon, indoor air quality, blown-in fiberglass, blown-in cellular, etc.?
Well, I may have a different answer than the others, but I find the Home Free resource as an excellent resource for residential. And Home Free is operated by the Healthy Building Network, and they do a great job of kind of giving you a broad overview of materials and helping you to see a good, better, best ranking of those materials. So I would start there with the Home Free website.
I would say Mindful Materials is more commercial based at this time. It's not to say there isn't residential information in there. So I would ditto what Tori just said about residential applications.
And I use Home Free on commercial projects as well. They are a great resource, and one of the best tools on the website, I think, is their guide to millwork and how you can specify good, better, or best millwork in terms of health and environmental and human health.
Well, we're at time. Thank you all so much for your time today. I think it was a really valuable conversation, and you all are very inspiring to me and to others. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what more comes of everything. And if anyone has any question for the panelists, please send Ashley or I questions, and we will forward them to the panelists. And we are recording this, so at some point we will send this out to those of you who attended.
Thanks for
you.
having me.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thanks.
That was really good. I wish every architect had seen it.
I know. It's really important.